Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief.
The understanding of Russia, which is broadly as Russia as a great power that has its own special path, that has a mission, and that needs a strong state, and a different path to that of the West.
I think when you look at these other industries, what you find is that there's a lot of pain built up in different parts of the Russian economy. Some of it's only going to be felt over a longer period of time.
Baltic ways.
There were the countries that when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience.
The continent.
I think that this conflict today proves that we are able to go past grievances and that we are able to look into the future, into the common future together.
Report in short.
This is the real Achilles heel of Putin's mobilization.
And of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction.
These two countries are interacting militarily or have been interacting in several different conflicts. And in some cases, they're on the same side, and in some cases, they're not.
New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Report in Short.
This is Report in Short, a bite-sized podcast dedicated to bringing you FPRI's Eurasia Scholarship. I'm Aaron, a fellow here at the Eurasia program, and I'll be speaking with experts about the research agenda that's keeping them busy. These are going to be topics that we could talk about for hours, but we're going to do it in under 15 minutes. Challenge accepted. Up first is a fresh-off-the-press report called the Wagner Group's Expanding Global Footprint. There's a link in the description. I was lucky enough to have two of its authors drop by. This is Report in Short. Thanks to both of you for joining the inaugural Report in Short. Let's jump straight in today and have you introduce yourselves. We'll start with you, Rafi.
Hi, yes, I'm Raphael Parens. I'm an independent researcher based in Congo-Brazzaville, the Republic of Congo, also depending on how you want to call it. And I'm keeping busy kind of looking into Wagner Group, trying to understand what the group's next moves might be and what potential U.S. responses should be.
And Chris, over to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Faulkner. I'm an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. I do research on private military and security companies, militant recruitment and behavior. I'm also, along with Rafi, working on the Wagner Group and kind of its operations in Ukraine and beyond. And just a quick disclaimer, the views expressed are my own, don't represent the U.S. government.
So these are two of our authors, but not all of them. So we'll have the full list in the episode description, and you can read their bios therein. But let's actually turn to today's question. And we'll start with a really, really basic one. I hope not too basic. What is Wagner Group? Rafi, let's start with you.
Yeah, this is a difficult question, surprisingly. I think Wagner Group is amorphous and constantly changing because of the nature of the group. It's an actor that's related to the Russian government, but it's also independent in that it gives the Russian state plausible deniability to kind of do what it wants. And it's also constantly evolving because it's operating in a bunch of different political, military, economic spheres. But the basis of the group is as a private military company. And then it has spooled out into these different economic and political roles in the countries where it's kind of taken root, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Chris, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think and as Rafi's kind of alluded to, I really think of this as not just a sole organ, but rather a network of different entities that are carving out influence for the Kremlin abroad. And in Ukraine, it's obviously serving as a tip of a spear in some form or fashion in some strategic, maybe less strategically important places, but symbolically important parts of the conflict. So, yeah, I think that's probably the big takeaway is it's really hard to isolate it as a one-stop shop. And rather to better think about it as a private military company that's got a bunch of different networks to it.
So if I can ask a follow-up there, I think this actually parallels Russia as a whole, where in the common parlance and the way people talk about it, there's Putin, who decides everything that happens in Russia unilaterally. It's all him. And in reality, it's a much more complicated network of interlocking interests. What you're saying is Wagner is the same way, this Prigozhin guy, and we can maybe talk about him a little bit. He's not really pulling all the strings by himself?
Sure, I think that's probably safe to say. No one rules all, and there's certain folks who are quote unquote pulling the puppet strings that it both empower and can disempower Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, at least symbolically head of the Wagner Group.
Raph, anything to add with that one?
I would agree with Chris on that. I think it's like a state or like a company, there are multiple organs, multiple people in different countries, especially because Wagner is operating in all of these different countries, who can pull the strings at any given time and might have more or less power.
So let's stick with you, Raphael, for this next kind of question, our roadmap for today. How has Russia used Wagner Group? Has this changed at all? And are we seeing differences in how it's being employed in different regions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think Wagner Group began as a sort of discrete tool for the Russian state to basically operate outside of its traditional sphere of influence, particularly in Africa, on the military side, under this guise of plausible deniability, because Wagner Group is a mercenary group and Russia has outlawed mercenary groups within its own country. It creates this sort of layer of difference between the two. So that was the original operation. It was Wagner coming into countries, creating a military relationship between the Russian state and several African states. And then it kind of evolved as the war in Ukraine happened, and it moved into a sort of frontline force there. And now what Chris and I and our other co-authors are sort of arguing in this paper is that it's potentially moving back towards that initial sort of expeditionary role.
So, Chris, does that mean its role in Ukraine, I guess, if it's becoming more expeditionary, its role as I don't want to say a cannon fodder tool, but essentially it's no longer being used just to throw prisoners at, Ukrainian machine gun nests with predictable consequences?
Yeah, sure. I think that's probably a safe description of it. It very much became cannon fodder, and I think we can see that by for those who are following Prigozhin's recruitment of prisoners from penal colonies across Russia. And I think Wagner got a little too big for its own britches, if you will, and Prigozhin's maybe tried to usurp too much power, or at least the limelight in Ukraine, that has suggested that the Kremlin's looking to empower others and re-empower the Ministry of Defense to be the face of the war in Ukraine. And so I think Prigozhin, and as Rafi kind of suggested already, is trying to figure out where we can recapture some of that flame. And I think abroad is where they see probably the most value, in addition to kind of operating still on the front lines in Ukraine.
Let's, for a second, stick on this topic of Prigozhin. I think he's an interesting character. And one of my favorite kind of facts about him is the actual etymology of his name. Prigoditsa in Russian is to come in handy. So this is a guy who's around these Kremlin circles because he's useful. So tell me a little bit more about him. I know sometimes he's called Putin's chef. How did he come into the picture? Was this Putin or the Kremlin as a whole had this need for this offhanded tool, or did he pitch the idea? What do we know about him?
There's some mystery surrounding Prigozhin as an entity in Russia. The story goes that he has a long history of a connection to Putin, dating back to the early 1990s in St. Petersburg. And I think that relationship in some form or fashion is evolved over time, where Prigozhin's been able to carve out influence via the connection to Putin as a catering service that he built, and then subsequently is parlayed into a bunch of other business ventures, all housed under this broader organization known as the Concord Group, that serves as kind of the hub of all of Prigozhin's subsidiary companies. And so I think that's really kind of the way to understand it is he was in the right place at the right time and connected to the right people at the right time, and that has served him well as he's kind of risen through, quote unquote, the ranks. I'll caveat all of this by suggesting that there's a lot of debate right now about the degree to which Prigozhin actually has, Putin on speed dial, for lack of a better way to describe it. And a lot of folks are probably rightly arguing that he's not as strong as maybe he's cast himself to be in Ukraine. And part of his amplification of the Wagner Group and his appearance in media and his promotion of the Wagner Group is more of an effort to illustrate its utility to Putin directly, both in Ukraine and beyond.
He's been, I remember on some of the Telegram channels, fairly outspoken and often critical of Russian Ministry of Defense. And I mean, certainly on Twitter, a lot of talk why are they letting him do this? But For this interest of time, let's keep marching on to our next question here, and we'll turn this to Rafi. So this paper you wrote, and of course there's a link in the description, ultimately it's calling for policy to address Wagner, potentially mitigate its influence. I recall there being 10 points. Talk me through some of the highlights. How do Western countries who would seek to mitigate Wagner's ability to conduct business, what do they do?
So we've kind of looked at a broad spectrum of different approaches, from the very minute, sanctioning this company's, sanctioning the business partners of Wagner Group, who are involved intimately in their economic activities, whether it's in Central African Republic or it's in Cameroon. It's very important to connect all of these pieces and make sure all of the different elements are being sanctioned. And that goes along with sanctioning potentially state partners who are involved with Wagner Group. So it goes from things like that all the way to U.S. senior leader in diplomatic engagement with African leaders. We've seen that pick up very recently, but that's also another area where it should not only the meetings themselves are one element, but evolving into greater sort of long-term policy is another thing. And then we also, we talk about international bodies, potentially working through the African Union, the Economic Community of West African States, other such bodies to build sort of peacekeeping and counters to instability that don't perhaps exist today.
Anything to add there, Chris?
Yeah, I think one of the big things, and maybe this is the overarching theme with, in order to combat the Wagner Group, we need to think about why they become an attractive resource and what types of regimes might be seeking them out. And Rafi and I have had this conversation a dozen times or more, is we have to think about the ways to stop conflict, stop extremist organizations that are exploiting instability in the countries in which Wagner's found willing and ready clients. And so that's a lot easier said than done. And I don't have a perfect answer to how to do that. But that becomes an important aspect of thinking about the broader strategic efforts that we should be considering.
Let's pull that thread for a second. So what kinds of regimes and what kind of situations would appeal to Wagner for assistance?
Yeah, sure. So I think we could just follow around the map when we think about states that are in conflict. And in this case, the most recent buyer of Wagner services would be Mali, which is run by a military junta. So a state that isn't a democracy, that has seen some fragile civil-military relations, a coup, multiple coups in the last few years, and subsequently is facing pretty violent Islamic extremist organizations throughout the country that are creating difficult security challenges for local populations, and the military is demanding a resolution. A whole bunch more to unpack there related to Western intervention that hasn't gone particularly well, in this case, the French. And so Russia, via the Wagner Group, has been able to exploit that. And I think that's a similar type story in some of its other campaigns.
Rafi, we have time for one last question, this being report in short. Any unanswered questions from your research or things you'd like to take a deeper dive on next?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things to look at is how we address this change in French policy. Emmanuel Macron came out a couple of months ago, I think at this point, and said that France is completely reorienting the way that they do military policy on the continent towards being more Africa leadership heavy. So how does this look basically to the United States and to U.S. policymakers? How do we need to change our policy now, especially as Russia is becoming more involved? So that's, I think, one angle. It's the policy and the military angle, but I do also think it's important to talk about the civilian side, the State Department, non-government sort of organizational side. How can we improve those things on the ground and prevent the elements that create A, jihadism, B, support for groups like Wagner Group in these countries?
All that said, thank you for joining today. If this episode and subject matter is up your alley, take a minute or 30 to read the paper. Report in Short is brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. Thanks for tuning in.